The midnight ride to warn Lexington and Concord. The messengers. The two messengers waiting in Charleston for the signal were Paul Revere and William Dawes. They rode off to warn John Hancock, Samuel Adams, the Lexington militia, and the Concord militia that the British Army was on its way. After warning Hancock, Adams, and the militia in Lexington, the two men then met up with a third messenger, Samuel Prescott, to ride to Concord. On the way to Concord, the British Army patrol stopped the three messengers. Dawes turned back to Boston, and Revere was arrested and taken back to Lexington. Only Prescott was able to escape and get to Concord to warn the colonists about the advancing British Army. Only one messenger is remembered. So why do people only talk about Paul Revere? The three messengers were not considered important by the colonists. It was only after Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem in 1863 called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere that the ride and Revere became legendary. Although Samuel Prescott alone got to Concord, both he and William Dawes became lost in history because Longfellow's poem focused on Revere. Revere was already famous as a silversmith in Boston. He was the messenger who was remembered for the ride to warn the colonists about the approach of the British Army. Here you can see a copy of the poem that was written. Here you could listen to the poem made into a rap for your entertainment. The British Army goes to Lexington and Concord. The first fighting in the Revolutionary War occurred at Lexington and Concord. Nobody knows who actually started shooting. The British said the colonists started shooting first, while the colonists said the British started the battle. What is known is that the colonists won the Battle of Lexington and Concord because they inflicted so many casualties on the British. A casualty was a soldier who could not fight because of wounds, injury, sickness, or death. When the British Army finally returned to Boston, they had many casualties. The British listed their casualties as 1 lieutenant colonel killed, 2 lieutenant colonels wounded, 2 captains wounded, 9 lieutenants wounded, 1 lieutenant missing, 2 ensigns wounded, 1 sergeant killed, 4 wounded, 2 missing, 1 drummer killed, 1 wounded, 62 rank and file or regular soldiers killed, 157 wounded, and 24 missing. That makes a total of 269 British casualties. When you look at the number of colonial casualties, there were 49 killed, 34 wounded, and 5 missing, which means they had a total of 88. Because British had many, many more casualties, the colonists won the battle. Summary of Lexington and Concord. Britain's desire to destroy colonial weapons caused the first battles of the Revolutionary War. The problem for the British was that the colonists were collecting large stockpiles of military supplies. As a solution, General Gage ordered the militia's stockpiles destroyed and 2 of the colonial leaders arrested. The effect was the colonists won the first battles. The British lost many soldiers, and the colonists became angrier and more united against the British. Preparing to fight. The Second Continental Congress. John Hancock was chosen president of the Congress. So the person who General Gage wanted arrested, now let's go back. Okay. Preparing to fight. The Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775 because the Intolerable Acts had not been repealed and because the fighting at Lexington and Concord made people angry. John Hancock, the person General Gage wanted arrested, was chosen president of the Congress. The Second Continental Congress did 2 things at the start of their meeting. We already know the first one, the Olive Branch Petition. The first thing the delegates did was send King George the Olive Branch Petition. You read about this petition earlier. You also know how King George reacted to it. King George would not even read the Olive Branch petition and instead issued the Proclamation of Rebellion. The second thing the Second Continental Congress did was to organize an army and a navy to fight against the British. The colonial representatives called the Army of the 13 Colonies the Continental Army. The Continental Army was like the local colonial militias because it was formed to protect the colonists from the British Army. The Continental Army was different from the colonial militia because the Continental Army included men from many different areas, and it could move around and fight against the British Army in all 13 of the colonies. Remember, each local militia fought only in their own colonial region. The Continental Army could fight anywhere. Choosing a commander-in-chief. The Second Continental Congress named George Washington as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. A commander-in-chief is the person in charge of the entire armed forces. Historians believe Washington was chosen as commander-in-chief for 3 reasons. First, Washington wanted the job. Washington actually wore a general's uniform to meetings of the Second Continental Congress. Second, he was one of the few representatives of the Second Continental Congress that had any military experience. Remember, Washington was an officer in the military that fought for the British during the French and Indian War. Third, Washington was from Virginia, a southern colony which also had the largest population of all the colonies. Remember, most of the problems the colonies had with Britain concerned New England, so by selecting a war leader from the largest southern colony, the Continental Congress was getting other regions involved in the fight against the British. It was one of the Continental Congress's first steps towards uniting all 13 colonies against the British. The Battle of Breed's Hill, also known as Bunker's Hill. While the Second Continental Congress was meeting, the colonial militia around Boston, Massachusetts became involved in yet another battle with General Gage and his British soldiers. George Washington and the Continental Army were not part of this battle. Breed's Hill. After the fighting in Lexington and Concord, some radical militiamen wanted to strike back at the British Army. Therefore, radical militiamen took up positions on Breed's Hill during the evening of June 16, 1775. Breed's Hill was just to the north of Boston across the Charles River. Throughout the night, the militiamen readied for a battle on top of Breed's Hill by digging trenches and using logs to make walls. You can see a picture of the log wall here. General Gage was very surprised the next morning when he found out that the colonial militia were on top of Breed's Hill. General Gage knew that from that hill, militiamen would be able to fire their cannons at British warships in Boston Harbor. He decided that very day he must retake Breed's Hill and make the colonists retreat. The British plan of attack, or battle plan, was simple. General Gage and other leaders of the British Army believed the colonial militia would run away from Breed's Hill without fighting if they were attacked by a much larger British force, because the militiamen were, in his words, cowardly dogs. However, the colonial militia did not plan to retreat. The British attacked Breed's Hill. On the morning of June 17, 1775, more than 2,000 British troops crossed the Charles River to attack the colonial militia. The British Army battle plan was to march up Breed's Hill and start fighting. Occasionally, the British troops would stop marching and fire their muskets, a type of rifle from the 1700s and 1800s at the colonists. Because the British muskets were not accurate and could not shoot long distances, those bullets did not even reach the militiamen. The colonial plan? The colonial battle plan was this. The militiamen used a different plan than the British because they stayed behind the log walls as the British marched up the hill. The colonial soldiers did not have a lot of bullets, and they did not have a lot of gunpowder, and they didn't want to waste those. So they would wait. They would wait until the British were very close to the log wall.